I've never seen schools that can take a low-income minority kid and substantially reduce the racial learning gap that you see in traditional schools, and they do it in great numbers.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Vashanta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom, powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Well, welcome back, friends, to the Bold by Choice podcast, where we explore the roots, revolutions, and the realities of the charter school movement. I'm your host, Vashanta Harris.
And I'm Don Cooper. Today, we continue our Founders Library series with a conversation that connects journalism, research, and the people who sparked a movement.
Oh, yes, I'm super excited about our featured guest today, Richard Whitmire, longtime education journalist and author of The Founders, a book that was commissioned by the 74 Million and drawn from the archives of the National Charter Schools Founders Library.
Whitmire spent years tracing the rise of the high-performing charter school networks, names we know like KIPP, Uncommon, and Achievement First, and the unexpected culture of collaboration that made them succeed.
That's right. In his words, the story isn't just about policy or structure. It is about people choosing to share rather than compete, even when the world expected rivalry.
So today we'll hear Whitmire reflect on what he discovered while writing The Founders, how a spirit born in Harriet Ball's Houston classroom spread across the nation, narrowing learning gaps and redefining what's possible for students who had been left behind.
Well, let's dive in. Journalist Richard Whitmire on The Founders and the enduring power of sharing.
Well, I've been interested in high-performing charters for some time, and I've known Don Shalvey for some time, but it was always a telephone connection. I never actually met him. He was just delightful and funny on the phone. And then in Sacramento, I actually had a chance to meet him. And it was classic Don Shalvey. You know, you meet him in a hotel lobby in the middle of the day, and he goes, "No, this is boring. Let's go across the street. I know this nice bar, and I got these cheese and a glass of wine," and sat down, had this great talk. And at the end, he goes, "You know, there's a great book if you following the path that the high-performing charters have taken and all the people-to-people relationships and what made that happen." And like this light bulb went off in my head, and I go, yes, that is a great book. And at the time, I had no market for it. I did have a fellowship, Emerson Collective Fellowship, that allowed me some free time. So Don and I, in the beginning, did some co-interviewing together, but I could tell it was a great idea, and that's where the idea for the book came from. Don Shalvey is this amazing, buoyant personality, and he's just effusive all the time, and he's just bustling, and he's full of energy and ideas, and he's so good with people-to-people relationships that you can see how he's been so successful in life. And actually, my favorite story about Don came from Norman Atkins, who was describing Don at these meetings and how everybody loved him and was listening to him. And he goes, "You know, Don Shalvey is the guy, at the end of the night, you want to end up sitting next to him at the bar." As soon as Norman said that, I go, yes, that totally nails Don Shalvey. Well, I first became interested in high-performing charters when I was on the editorial page at USA Today. And I started discovering these schools and writing about them. And I was also, at the time, writing a lot about boys and why boys are falling behind in school. And when I left the editorial board, my first book was on boys, and it was called Why Boys Fail. And to write the book, I wanted to find 3 schools where boys were succeeding. They were doing as well as the girls, and they're actually kind of tough to find. And I found 3, and 2 of the 3 were charter schools. One was a KIPP school in Washington, and the other was an Uncommon school for boys in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area in New York. So I'd followed boys, one particular boy, through both of those charter schools for a year. And that was my first really sustained exposure to what these kinds of charters could do. And I was just blown away by the potential. I'd been covering schools for more than a decade at that point, and I'd never seen anything like this. And immediately it clicked that these particular schools, these top charters, have a potential that's not even yet realized. I was interested in how the sharing came about because these charter schools really are competitors. They compete for foundation money, they compete for press attention, they compete for teachers especially, and for students. And if you look at any other area in society where you have that kind of competition, let's say Apple and Samsung, you would never have any cooperation. They would keep their secrets from one another. And here, just the opposite happened. Right from the very beginning, they shared. And it didn't have to turn out that way, but it did. And so while I was reporting the book, I was puzzled over why, where did this culture come from? And finally, it was in an interview with Dave Levin that another light bulb went off, and he started talking about Harriet Ball, who's described in the book as teacher number one, teacher zero. And Harriet is the one the teacher way back when in Houston who taught the KIPP founders all the techniques that you see not only in KIPP but other high-performing schools. And Harriet was impressed by how much they wanted to learn from her, all the rhythms and the cadences. And Levin said she said to him at one point, one day I imagined that I would pass on all these techniques. It just never occurred to me to be some white Jewish kid from New York who would be the one to do it. But she said, I'm happy to pass it on, but on one condition, that you have to share. And so Levin considers that just the beginning of that sharing ethos. And I think he's right. That's probably where it started. I've never seen schools that can take a low-income minority kid and substantially reduce the racial learning gap that you see in traditional schools. And they do it in great numbers. And I've just never seen that before. And when you realize how urgent this issue is, when you realize and you understand that now fully half of the students enrolled in our K-12 schools fit that description. Low-income minority, and there are just so many kids who are losing out on the potential, and the country's losing out on them being able to engage in our free enterprise system. And so there's this really, I consider, a desperate need to offer this kind of education to more kids. And I'm not saying traditional schools always don't do it, but their success rate doesn't begin to match what I see in these schools. That's why I consider them so important. And frankly, I see part of their importance in collaborating with traditional schools. And there is some of that going on, not enough from my potential, but when you look at cities like Denver or Spring Branch in Houston, and you see how they're using these high-performing charters, they see them not as competitors or rivals, but as collaborators, it's kind of heartening. And I certainly think that it's logical that more school districts will reach out, and I think based on necessity, they're going to have to. There's so many school districts that are just down and out enough, like the St. Louis and Kansas City and LA, Baltimore, the chronic underperformers. Frankly, at this point, I don't see that they have a lot of choice. Well, if among charters, of course, the collaboration and the potential of collaboration within the charter communities is so important. But the charter people, the top ones, already know this. So I guess my message to leaders of traditional school districts is, go visit one of these charters. I mean, that's what Duncan Klusman, the superintendent of schools in Spring Branch, did. He went to see a KIPP, and then he went to see a Yes Prep, and he came away, he goes, I need some of that in my school district. And what struck me is how rare that is. It should happen a lot, and it doesn't, because charters are seen as competitors. They're taking their kids away. And I understand where that came from, but it's going to be a hard corner to turn for a lot of these superintendents, but I think it has to be turned. So to me, that's the message of the book. Let's start turning the corner here, and a lot less fighting and a lot more, sitting down and sharing. I love that so much of the founder's book is about the history, because one thing I found when I started going to these charter organizations is they're also relatively new, that they have no history. Sometimes their history on their webpage is just a few paragraphs long. So fully half or more than half the book is on establishing that history, especially the people-to-people relationships. But then I wanted to take it into the future a bit and say, where are we going next? Because a lot of these people, these original founders, people like Don Shalvey and Norman Atkins, they're taking charters into what I'll call Charters 3.0. The latest version of charters, and these are charters that really take advantage of the whole personalization in education, so that each student is set on an independent learning path, and so they are internally motivated to learn, because that's what these first generation charter founders learned when their kids went to college. They could get them into college at amazing rates, but they didn't persist at the rates that were predicted. And that's because they ran across so many challenges in college that middle class kids just don't pay any attention to. They're not challenges at all. But for these kids, it was a huge issue. And so they didn't persist through college. And so now they're going back and making the learning more personalized and internally driven. So that when this this student arrives on a college campus, that they're directing their own learning, they're self-motivated. And that's a really important experiment now, because a lot of these charters, IDEA and KIP and Uncommon, they're making incredible gains in boosting the 6-year graduation rate. You know, it might have started off at 40%, and now some of them are into the upper 80s. And they're shooting to do even better. So it's some remarkable work that I'll call the next generation charters, and I'm able to profile 4 at the end of the book.
You know, Don, I really loved listening to that clip. I learned a lot that I did not know just from listening to Richard Whitmire kind of share these stories out. And I haven't read the book yet. I'm going to do that. I'm really intrigued about a lot of these founders and the stories that he's sharing.
Well, the great thing about the book is you can download it for free from the Founders Library at charterlibrary.org.
That's right. So I was just thinking we can maybe share some of our key takeaways for the listeners today before we wrap up. And one of the things that I really was thinking about is kind of the story behind the founders. One thing I was thinking about is kind of the story behind the founders, which began to me with curiosity and connection. And so he talks about his connection and this conversation he had with Don Shalvey, which, folks, if you've been paying attention this season, we actually talked about in a couple episodes prior to this one. And so he's saying that Don Shalvey kind of sparked this idea to follow the personal relationships that really built our high-performing charter schools. I mean, there were folks literally getting together and talking and sharing ideas, just as Harriet Ball, gave that advice to Dave Levin, share everything. And they were doing just that. And that's something that I thought was like pretty cool coming out of listening to this clip.
Yeah, it really is. It's just a fascinating thing about the charter schools movement, of how it's a team of people that's united to get better results for kids. And that leads to a really important second takeaway, that high-performing charters succeed because of that cooperation, not because of competition. So what Whitmire was struck with was that KIP, Uncommon, and Achievement First, organizations that sometimes we think of as competing with each other for teachers, resources, attention, they really shared everything. And that's what has made them great. So unlike an Apple versus Samsung, they opened doors to each other and they compared notes. They
Mhm.
open sourced the culture, and that became the movement's secret sauce over time.
That's right. I almost wish I had been able to sit under the tutelage of Harriet Ball. I think about like what the experience must have been that Dave Levin had, being able to like take his lunch break and go into our classroom and just really take in the lessons that she were teaching the students, but also in her teaching style, the lessons that she then also gave to other adults. And I just think that sharing ethos and tracing that back to this amazing educator is so real. And I'm really excited that, Harriet Ball's story tells us, let's not only learn what we need to learn for ourselves, but to then share it. Harriet Ball's story tells us not only to learn what we need to learn for ourselves, but to also share what we learn and make sure that we continue that. And I believe that that single act of generosity, that gift of sharing, really shaped the DNA of the entire charter sector.
So not only did it shape the DNA of the entire charter schools movement, it also resulted in a culture that dramatically narrowed racial learning gaps. Whitmire witnessed what few thought was possible: schools where low income minority students achieved at levels on par with their affluent peers. He called it one of the most hopeful, undertold stories in American education. And I think that hope really does go back to Harriet Ball's classroom, that culture of sharing. When people saw something that could be done, they were excited about it, wanted more people to do it, wanted more people to try it, and get better results for kids across the nation.
That's right. So I'm just really excited that we have a book like The Founders. It really captures living legacies. He has documented the relationships, the risks, the values that built the charter movement. And there's some powerful stories in there about really great schools. It's a reminder to me personally that data tells part of the story. But let's be honest, the people make all the difference.
That's right. And what Richard Whitmire reminds us of is that movements endure when people choose to collaborate instead of compete. The founders of modern charters didn't guard their secrets, they shared them. And that's what helped get the success that we have today.
That's right. And I'm excited that we're doing that also. It's in that spirit, rooted in Harriet Ball's classroom and carried forward by teachers like Dave Levin, continues to inspire educators who believe that when we share what works, every child wins.
Today's story moved you? Check out Whitmire's book, The Founders, at charterlibrary.org and share this episode with someone building the next chapter of this work.
That's right, friends. And if you haven't already, I invite you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Make this relationship official with the Bold by Choice podcast. Follow us, like our episodes, and share them with friends and family. Well, next time, we're going to feature another voice from the Founders Library, another story of vision turned into action. Until then, stay bold, and we'll see you next week.